Sri Aurobindo is describing how the different planes of consciousness are formed, what characterizes them and distinguishes them, and what their interrelations are. And all of this is part of the larger context of a deeper knowledge of what binds and limits us and how we can be free of these bindings and limitations in our spiritual evolution. In the portion we had just read, Sri Aurobindo first described the characteristics of the physical world. It's something which we know very well because we are living in it all the time, and yet he went to the peculiar and particular things which belong only to the physical world or cause the physical world to be as it is. And then, in contrast, he shifts the discussion to the vital world, life world. And there we saw that it is primarily, being a world of life force, it is primarily a world of desire and satisfaction of impulse, and therefore it can be just called a desire world. The nature of desire, though, is that it always seeks enjoyment, and so everything in this world is seeking fulfillment in enjoyment of its impulses. But because it is a world which is bound and limited, any limitation involves a positive and negative side to the enjoyment, and therefore it is a world also of extreme positive enjoyments as well as extreme negative enjoyments or worlds. Being more fluid and free than the gross physical, dense material substance, it also allows for finer gradations of substance as well as worlds. And this is what leads to what Sri Aurobindo has described here as the lowest heavens and all the hells which the traditions have imagined or used to attract us or terrify human beings. And it was an important concept we touched last time, that all the religions which speak of heavens and hells as either rewards or punishments are really pointing to these domains of the vital world. It is not a spiritual experience, it is not a spiritual heaven in comparison to a hell, and you can recognize this simply by the particular features that they describe these heavens and hells to have. And it is always in the heavens some kind of satisfaction of desire. The waters flow, the waters are sweet and perfumed, or everything tastes wonderful, the music is wonderful, you are enjoying yourself in various ways depending on what the particular tradition wants to attract you with. And the hells are the things which are the abhorrence and the suffering and the pains, etc. All of these very distinctly are characteristics of the vital plane. And so it is often a shock for people to recognize that which was presented as a spiritual goal or even a spiritual reward is in fact nothing more than the domains, maybe lower or higher domains of the vital worlds, in fact very low. There are higher ranges which are also called heavens, which belong properly to the mental domains, which have a very different character, where the primary drive is not satisfaction of desire. And there are ranges beyond which belong to the spiritual proper, and these too can be called heavens, but they are not what the religions normally point to. So this is one aspect which we had highlighted last time. We dwelt at length in our discussion last time on the mother's comments of the characteristics of the vital world and the possibility of exteriorizing into them, wandering and experiencing things in them, the dangers and the requirement to be able to explore them without being harmed. And you will recall, when you are in the vital body, you are the very substance of your desires and impulses. So whatever impulses and desires are your personality, those are freely released and they are what drive you. Whatever fears you have equally are constantly and freely expressed, and they are what form the nature of your experience. And because forms are more fluid, it is also an experience in which, according to your internal state, your relationship with things undergoes a constant change. And so it is a strange world as well as a dangerous world, for which we saw the first and most important requirement is absolute freedom from fear, but also to the extent that you are free from these impulsivenesses of desire, you are able to not only master yourself, but modulate your experiences of the vital world and even shift through levels of the vital world. Sri Aurobindo now comes to a very important discussion, having explored the physical and the vital in their characteristics. What is it that connects these two, if anything? And this is the next paragraph that we are now taking up today. As I mentioned last time, in this paragraph, one could say every single sentence describes an essential principle or truth of the occult knowledge, but presented in a way that is at a principle level. One does not always recognize the full implications of it. So as we read, we will also dwell on some of these implications. Sri Aurobindo does speak of some of these things in his other writings, particularly in his letters, but we will as if condense some of that as we read along. So, nature being a complex unity and not a collection of unrelated phenomena, there can be no unbridgeable gulf between the material existence and this vital or desire world. So, the statement is very simple. There is no unbridgeable gulf between these two. In fact, they are connected. But before getting to this, he is telling you one of the fundamental principles. Nature is a complex unity and not a collection of unrelated phenomena. What does that mean in practice? And we can highlight the difference between these two ideas with a simple example. When a child walks into a play store or a play pen, children's corner, where lots of toys are kept, they have all been stored in a basket, and the guardian takes the basket and dumps it on the floor. Out come maybe a dozen or 2 dozen toys. The child looks at all the toys. He's already seen and played with half of them, and there are only a few left that he can play with. Each toy is distinct and separate. He can play with them or play with another or another. Having played with all of them, he has exhausted the full possibility of his play. That's all there is to it. Consider now, instead, a big drum in which you do not have distinct objects, but many energies, many fluid substances of colors, smells, sounds, and they are each of them moving, dynamic. Each is mixing with others. So think of a fluid in which many different colors of oils have been poured in. They are distinct, but they are also blending in each other. Now, as you take the drum and begin to pour out, already the mixing which was happening in the drum is further mixed in the very act of pouring out. And what comes out is fundamentally different from anything you've seen before. And every time you pour it out, what comes out is a different mix, a different pattern, a different experience. Why? Because each of these fluids is constantly blending with other fluids, and there is a constant variation and change, and there is nothing in the drum which is not affected by other things. And the universe is like this, nature is like this. Not a series of fixed pieces accumulated together, even if it is infinite, but rather each thing is constantly in a dynamic movement of change, rearrangement, and even growth, or subsiding. Each is linked with everything else, drawing from each other, enriching itself, or depleting. And so every time you look, you see something different. Every time you reach out to play, you have a whole new experience of toys and experiences possible. You may approach a single experience once and approach it a second time, it's never the same. Because in the very fact of experiencing it once, you have changed and you have changed it. And it has changed everything else. So one person experiences this, he asks someone else to join and experience this. The second person will not have the same experience because already in the first experience everything has changed. Such is the nature of this universe, a complex unity, and that's what makes for it to be so wonderful and so surprising and so creative. So nature being a complex unity and not a collection of unrelated phenomena, there can be no unbridgeable gulf between the material existence and this vital or desire world. Now apply this to what he's saying, no unbridgeable gulf. It's not just no unbridgeable gulf, not just that there are bridges. The suggestion here is there is a constant interpretation and constant exchange and constant change. Nothing in the physical world remains the same because it is under constant influences of the vital, but nothing in the vital remains the same because it also is under constant influences not only of the physical but the mind and all other things. So the picture he is giving us is not just that these two are connected, but that these two are in a constant dynamic exchange and mixing, not only between themselves but with everything else in the universe. So that's the full sense of the sentence here. And then the next sentence. On the contrary, they may be said in a sense to exist in each other and are at least interdependent to a certain extent. Now this gives you an even greater insight. Where is the vital world? Up there somewhere? In the heavens, which are somewhere above the clouds? In the old days, when you could not fly very high, you could only jump a little, you couldn't fly at all perhaps. Heaven was up there because it was beyond your reach, beyond your sight. But the sense of high, light, free was what put it up there. Today you fly above the clouds, you fly into outer space. Where is that heaven? And so you have to now begin to question that symbolism of a vertical layering. The vital world is right here, interpenetrating the physical world. The physical world is interpenetrating the vital. Between the two, there is only a degree of interaction. Parts, denser parts of the vital which engage with the physical directly. Other parts may not engage directly but indirectly may influence. Similarly, from the physical, there are parts turning to the vital and those influence the vital, but others remain dull, insensitive, resistant. So, first picture is that they exist in each other and are at least interdependent to a certain extent and perhaps much more. At least interdependent, meaning each is dependent on the other. And what's the nature of this dependence? And he will come to a sentence now which is one of the most stunning descriptions of the relationship between the physical and the vital world. Again, something you will not find anywhere in any text of any tradition that survives. The closest to this idea is in the Vedic tradition, and I will refer to how it describes it. But the sense of this intermissence of these two worlds has massive implications. It means when you want to influence something in the vital world, you can actually do it through a physical object which connects to or is influenced by vital energies. If you want to influence the physical object from the vital world, similarly, it can be done from a vital action or a strong energy put out, which can influence the physical. And so the implications of these two blending together are so great. And you can immediately recognize how this knowledge is utilized in many occult practices. For example, if you take a plant, it is a perfect representation of mixing of vital and physical things. It's physical matter and yet vital energy blended in it. Take two different plants, and the quality of vital energy blended in each is completely different, which makes for the energetic quality of the plant and also its healing characteristics or poisonous or other characteristics. It's the energy content. Both are drawing the same physical soil, the same water, the same sunlight, the same fresh air. And yet this develops different qualities, that develops different, because energetically they represent a different quality of energy. Now if you take these two plants, here is a physical object you are holding which gives you access to an energy imprint inside the vital world. You rearrange their position, put them in a certain relation, you are influencing those two qualities of energies in the vital world. And the principle of using objects to influence energies or patterns of energy or even to precipitate energetic outcomes in the physical world now begins to make sense. But the basis for this knowledge is the fact that these two are blended into each other, they exist in each other. But how exactly is that relationship? And we come to this astounding description statement. He puts it like this: in fact, the material world is really a sort of projection from the vital, a thing which it has thrown out and separated from itself in order to embody and fulfill some of its desires under conditions other than its own, which are yet the logical result of its own most material longings. And this is an extraordinary statement. What he is saying here is, and there are four facets to the statement. First, that the material world is a projection from the vital. Think of the implications. It means everything in the material world has its roots in the vital world. But it represents as if a part or an aspect of the vital world and its experience, which it has as if pushed out of itself to form a separateness, as if. But it's never really separate because it's a projection from the vital. Second idea here, a thing which it has thrown out and separated from itself. So it's not just it has separated, it has thrown out. There is in the vital, as you have seen before, always this impulsiveness, always the desire drives. So nothing is done without some drive of energy, passion or desire. So if it chooses to separate out, well, it can be a gentle, passionate separation, or it can be a violent and intense passion which throws out. And this is the nature of it, thrown out, separated from itself. But for what? What purpose? And we come to the third idea. In order to embody and fulfill some of its desires under conditions other than its own. So in the vital world, think about it. The vital world is full of all kinds of desires. Every possible desire that you could have is present there as an energy, a movement, or even an entire world in itself, infinite in its own reality. And if every possible desire exists, there can also be the desire to give to itself body and form which is bound and rigid and not fluid as in the vital. Isn't it? Obviously, logically. So the part of the vital world which has this desire to embody itself and bind itself into rigidity of form and experience its desires in a condition which is not vital, That is the part of the vital world which then begins this process of separation, projection, and even separating by throwing out forcefully. So there's a movement to throw out in order that it may enter and embody. Interesting. The purpose of throwing out is to create a violent separation which is so different from the vital that it could be experienced as not vital. If it was a gentle separation, then the vital would still be very much present. You want it to not be you, so you go boom, and you throw it out violently to separate in quality. And of course, the whole movement is to embody, or the purpose was to embody. So there's a coarse, dulling, limiting, binding, hardening movement of the throwing out to form something different and contrary. For purpose then of re-engaging with it, to embody and experience the vital desire in that otherness of itself. So, in order to embody and fulfill some of its desires under conditions other than its own, and then the fourth idea, which are yet the logical result of its own most material longings. The very fact that you want to experience this is the natural outcome of the longing in the vital to experience materiality. It wants to experience materiality, and logically the only way is to project out of itself the material thing and then to engage with it to experience it. Now this description is fascinating because here now again the implications are so important. Everything that exists in the physical world has its roots in the vital. You tweak the roots there, it will change things in the physical world, because it's as if a projection of something in the vital, a bundle of energy or a quality or type of or pattern of energy at the basis of the physical material form. You could as if enter into the life energy in the plant and tweak it there materially to change the plant pattern, or you could tweak its source in the vital world and you could have the same result. So what modern science is doing is engaging with that vital energy which has embodied itself and tweaking it in its material aspect. That of course gives to it a great power, but that power is nothing compared to the power of tweaking it at its source, in its roots in the vital energy itself. And if you tweak it there, you can do far more and more precisely. I'm just pointing to certain suggestions, and of course the implications in the knowledge of the occult, many of these become now more obvious. But remember, behind that is the desire of the vital energy to experience itself in otherness of materiality. So what happens after the material world is thrown out? It then tries to get in. And that's the next part. He says, life on earth may be said to be the result of the pressure of this life world on the material. So, after creating the physical world or projecting out of itself the physical world, it now puts a pressure to organize the physical world for it to be able to embody. But briefly before we proceed, I said this idea of the projection of a throwing out of the material world is there in the Vedic tradition. In a more general way, it is described as the, let's say, the levels or planes of consciousness. All of them are fluid. All of them have a far greater freedom and fluidity. But the physical world is so bound, so rigid, so dull, so ignorant, as to be so distinctly different from all of them. And so the Vedic vocabulary describes the physical world as utchishta, the stuff of other worlds which is as if thrown out as waste, as undigestible. Very interesting suggestion. It's as if from all the planes, the densest, darkest, dullest, unusable material thrown out is what gathers at the bottom to become the physical world. That's the sense of that movement, Uchishta, the word itself. Sri Aurobindo has a very beautiful description in Savitri, where he uses a particular word. I couldn't recall quite the word. It's a very unusual word, rarely used in the English language, which represents the substance in a barrel of wine which settles at the bottom. Dregs is the word used. There's another word called lees, but I could not find it in Savitri. Perhaps there's a third word which he used. And the description in those lines, it's because he uses that word, the suggestion is the whole cosmos is as if a barrel of wine, meaning it is a domain of the delight of the divine play. But at the bottom is where the most bitter, the most hard, the most dull, tar-like substance settles, and that's the physical world. The symbol is so beautiful. As you move up, then of course you're able to enjoy much more, and all the way to the higher gradations of enjoyment in the barrel that is the cosmos. So this is the Uchishta, the word from the Veda. So the material world is a sort of projection. And so life on earth eventually had to come up because that was the intention of the desire impulse from the desire world in throwing out this physical. So life on earth may be said to be the result of the pressure of this life world on the material, inconscient existence of the physical universe. In this physical universe, in the most material inconscient, which is unable even to feel, incapable of feeling, still it experiences the pressure from the life world, and as that pressure begins to act and is able to engage, it builds gradually life. In matter, out of matter, and it feels as if that which was stone and rock has now suddenly changed itself, become more elastic, plastic and self-organizing to create a complex structure like the plant or the flower. If you think about the implications of this, it means something entered matter or existed already inside matter, which has the power to shape matter itself, which has the power to transmute matter, because this flower, having grown out of soil, has no resemblance in its tissue to anything of the soil characteristics. Of course, if you analyze and go deep into the molecules and atoms, you will say, it is made up of the same atoms and molecules. But in the way it expresses itself, it is not sand, it is not mud. What it is, it never existed before. There is nothing in matter or in soil that has the characteristics of this perfume or this tissue of the petals of the rose. Because we are used to seeing flowers emerge, we say, oh yes, but that is material. But before life organized itself to build the flower, that was real matter. And there was nothing in it of this kind of matter. So literally life force took up matter, reshaped it to become a different kind of matter, more subtle, more plastic, more expressive of the life energy impulse. Created this matter, literally transformed the matter, and then into that matter infused something so complex that the overall, you will see the flower has a symmetry, and sometimes an extraordinary symmetry. There's a particular plant which used to be very valued in the old days because the character of the plant was each of its seeds weighs exactly the same. Isn't that amazing? While in the physical world, everything is so different. The weight of each seed is exactly the same. It's the quality of the plant itself. There's no other plant which has this quality. Similarly, in the nature of the flower, on a particular given species, often, but not in all, often the number of petals is exactly 3 or 4. And occasionally you have aberrations, but in certain species there's no possibility of aberration. It is as if almost a rigid rule. what in the life energy has this particular need to create 4 petals or 5 petals, or to create a seed exactly of that particular weight. So in the old days, traders used to use that seed as a reference for weighing. That's why it was valued. And you can see that behind it, it has nothing to do with matter itself. It has to do with the impulse of life force working inside matter to shape for it to enjoy a particular type of desire experience, which corresponds to the quality of that flower or the plant or the leaf or the seed. In fact, then, if you look at all the plants, all the flowers, or any living thing, you can describe its characteristics by the life energy drive within it. What is the life force here trying to experience or express? That's what makes eventually for the form of the thing itself, for the perfume and quality of perfume of the flower, for the medicinal qualities of the plants or leaves, for the behavior patterns of the insects or animals. So the fact that the deer likes to leap and gracefully leap is a characteristic that the life energy desire in it wants to experience and express. It's what makes the deer what it is. The fact that the elephant is heavy and slow and gracefully lumbering as it moves is an expression of the desire impulse of the life force that it wanted to experience in this material form. And so the form is representative of the desire, the characteristic behavior of the form, and in the form is a representation of that desire energy. So when you begin to look at life in this way, the whole picture changes. We are no more seeing biological DNA determining things. We are seeing life energy creating DNA or other biological processes to fulfill itself. Now, if for some reason you were to suppress that life force, deny it, what will happen? The same fulfilling energy that is there will weaken, withdraw, and what happens to the form? You'll see the vitality of the form diminishing, enthusiasm and interest reducing, and so on, until it just weakens, fades out and dies away, or remains stunted. And this is what you see in many animals who are held in captivity. Dolphins, in fact, are so sensitive to the need for love that when they do not receive love in captivity, they go into a depression and die of depression. Many of the more complex and evolved animals face this problem in the zoo. Unless there is among the zookeepers at least one human being who gives them that need or that love, affection, or whatever their particular requirement is. Otherwise they just wither. The same animals in nature live much longer, and in the zoo their life tends to become shorter. On the other side, equally, if you continue to cut the plant and it is unable to fully express itself, it becomes a bonsai, dwarf size, limited, unable to fulfill or express its full potential. So the key is always the life force inside it. The biological processes are the means it has used to organize its impulse. For us to say biology makes the life is an error. What you can say, life organized these biological processes. By tweaking the biological processes, you can reroute the life. Only because life is bound in materiality and the rigidity of matter. But you can reroute for a while. Eventually, if life does not want that rerouting, it will find a way to bypass your reroute. In complex beings, it is obvious. You can threaten me to behave in a particular way, but the first chance I get, I will bypass your threat and find a way to escape to do what I want. But the same thing happens actually in the life force inside organisms. And if you meet the plant, it's not the fact that you talk to it, but the fact that you give to it this affectionate, nourishing energy, it makes the plant grow more healthy, more complete. Or even you could intervene by talking to it to modify some of its genetic characteristics. There is one very famous example of an American mystic farmer who had demonstrated this. If you recall the name, I've forgotten the name, but what he did was he took a rose bush and he would feel nature, nature's intention, he would feel the life force in plants. And so to this rose bush, every day he would spend a little time telling the rose bush, you don't need to grow thorns. I'm here to protect you. And again, imprinting this idea. And after a while, as the bush grew, it shed its thorns, it grew without thorns. And just from a direct energetic intervention. Think of the enormous implications of this. And this takes you to a domain way beyond the genetic intervention. So these are all very interesting implications which we now understand once we recognize the actual mechanism of life in matter. Life on earth may be said to be the result of the pressure of this life world on the material inconscient existence of the physical universe. Again, pause. Further implications. If this is the result, the whole life, plant, even animal, is the result of the vital world pressing upon the physical, remember there are other worlds. What happens when the mental world presses on the physical, or the mental world presses on the vital world, or the psychic presses on the vital or the mental or even on the physical? What are the implications of that? And all of these are great if just the vital world could create such a rich diversity of life. The mental world coming into it maybe could do so much more. And finally, if the spiritual consciousness begins to put its pressure not only on the mental, not only on the vital, but on the physical, what are the possibilities of that? What are the implications of that? And perhaps it goes beyond what the mind could conceive. Because suddenly the spiritual is able to bring powers which can override the inertia of matter and make matter do things which you would normally consider impossible for matter. So to say, bypass laws of physics. What are laws of physics? Habits of matter. They are not laws, they are just habits. And you intervene with your mental awareness, you can modify those habits to some extent. You intervene with a spiritual consciousness, you can modify to a great extent. So this one statement which he makes, although he is talking of the vital and physical, has enormous ramifications when you now apply it to relationship with other worlds and their action on each other, or particularly on the physical world. Life on earth may be said to be the result of the pressure of this life world on the material. Next statement again. Each statement, as I said, has incredible implications. Our own manifest vital being is also only a surface result of a larger and profounder vital being which has its proper seat on the life plane and through which we are connected with the life world. We have a vital body. And you can experience it, of course, as just this thing which you feel in you as flow of energy or emotions, or generally a sense of increased or reduced vitality. I'm more fresh, I'm more tired, there's a literally bursting with energy or depleted from energy. And you can feel as if when you're bursting with energy, your energy wants to burst out, it's even glowing out around you. You look at a person who has this excess energy, you can literally feel the energy around them. They enter the room and everybody gets perked up with energy. And you recognize just from these experiences that the vital energy we carry, the vital body of each person impacts you directly. Maybe it's impacting your vital, but still it's felt at a very physical level, and you experience it at a physical level. This part, our own manifest vital being, it manifests in the life, it's the most obvious part, plugging in. He says it's not just this, is also only a surface result of a larger and profounder vital being. So pause on the word also. Why is he saying also? The previous sentence was about life on earth, the result of the pressure of the life world. This also is the result of something else. So the suggestion is the true vital that you have is much larger and in fact is much more in the vital world. It is also pressing upon matter and as if forming this little narrow superficial vital being or vital body that you experience. Also, just that word also gives you the suggestion of that pressing upon the material world to form this. So our own manifest vital being is also only a surface result of a larger and profounder vital being. So only a surface result means what we experience as so great is the most surface part of something which is deep, wide, and more essentially belonging to the vital world. How wide? If this is just the surface, that can be enormously wide. In fact, there are experiences people have had not only within themselves, but even in seeing somebody, where you can experience this expanded to a huge extent. There is a very interesting incident that took place when the mother was once driving. She would occasionally go out for a drive, and she was driving towards the south, I believe towards Kadlur, in that direction, and somewhere along the way the car stopped and wouldn't start. And so inwardly she brought it to Sri Aurobindo's awareness, and Sri Aurobindo indicated to her that she had just reached the limit of his physical aura. And so they decided to turn around the car, and it started and drove back fine. So it was almost like an automatic protection that she was not to cross beyond that boundary. But you see what the range of the physical aura of Sri Aurobindo was. What that means is the most material part of his aura. And it's the range within which he can feel almost physically everything that is happening. It was similar experience mother had when she was approaching Pondicherry from the ship, that at some point she knew she had entered Sri Aurobindo's aura, and she noted, she asked the captain, it was about 10 nautical miles from Pondicherry town proper. She had also the experience at another time of seeing a huge light, and she knew it was part of his aura and the light that he was bringing in, but over the entire region. This gives you a sense of what is in fact possible. And if this is the case of the physical aura, the vital can be even more plastic, even larger. Doesn't mean it is so for everybody. But in its narrowest superficial part, it's about this much within our personal aura at most. But in its deeper, larger range, it could even feel itself as if extending beyond. So, the way he describes it here, the result of a larger and profounder vital being. It's not just in physical size, but in depth of quality of consciousness. It approaches, and which has its proper seat on the life plane, and through which we are connected with the life world. And this is part of that edge of the vital or even the mental body as it merges into the universe. It's that part which Sri Aurobindo refers to generally as the circumconscient, the interface between our individuality and the universality of each plane. And our vital similarly plugs into the universal vital and belongs in its origin on that level, through which we influence those things of that world, and those things of that world influence us, but all of which are behind the veil of our conscious awareness. What is it that separates us or prevents us from being aware of it is a question which he takes up in the next paragraph. But for now, he is simply describing this relationship. Now, let's pause for the implications. If our limited surface vital has its roots in the vital world and much larger and profounder. What are the implications for us practically? It means we can, let's say, engage with the surface part of the vital to tap into its deeper potentialities, of which we are not conscious. We are not conscious of it, but it is conscious of us because it is the source of our surface vital. Or the same principle with the mental, which we are conscious, which is very superficial, and the inner mental, which is much larger, more profound, and connects to things in the mental plane. So simple experiment you could do. You have a problem, you don't have a solution for it. You place the problem before you, and if you can consciously address the problem to the inner ranges of the mind and ask for help. And then you go to sleep. You have to stop your mental activity. So the best way is put it to sleep. You wake up in the morning and you realize, plop, there's an answer. And sometimes you may even wake up as if in part of a dream with the answer as it emerges of some process inside, as if something emerged from there, came into your surface mind. But the same principle you could to tap into the inner vital. You need an extra burst of energy or a certain force of vitality which is not possible for your surface vital. Turn inward, call upon that deeper range and invoke its action. And then you'll find something as if comes and fills and does it. It often happens in times of extreme crisis when you are not consciously calling for that, but just you are so desperate or the need is so great that the inner vital pushes out. There are many examples of such phenomena where a child's foot is stuck under the car and the child's mother in desperation simply lifts the car to get the child free. Afterwards you tell her to lift again, cannot do. In that moment of desperation, there was a surge of that vitality which came and took it and made your physical body even do things which it could not normally do. But if you could, by a discipline, by a process, tap into that, you could draw that potentiality and do things which would normally be considered impossible or miraculous. Such is the nature of many kinds of training of the vital, particularly in the martial arts. There is a capacity which is described in certain monastic traditions, monks who live particularly in the Himalayas or in snowy regions of the Himalayas or in Tibet, that some of them are taught a method by which they can intensify the heat of the body so that they can live bare-bodied in the snow. They lie down and sleep in the snow. At night, your core temperature drops. But they sleep, they have no hypothermia. They get up next morning and continue to walk kilometers in the snow barefoot. The food they carry in their little bag is so little, has not enough calories to sustain you in your city life. But they're able to not only sustain themselves, they are healthy with strong bodies, nice padding of fat, but they're walking for kilometers every day in the bare snow, sleeping in the bare snow. How does it work? They're tapping into the life energy and activating it, and all the heat you need is available to you, as well as everything, all the energy required. So the suggestion here is that we can tap into those possibilities, draw things from the vital, or equally influence things in the vital or the mental. So the implications of this, again, you can see how it could turn into a practical knowledge to be developed. Then, moreover, the life world is constantly acting upon us, and behind everything in material existence there stand appropriate powers of the life world. So it's as if now taking this earlier idea to a more general level. It's our vital body has its base in the larger, more complete vital in the vital world, but now he is extending the idea the life world is constantly acting upon us, not only through our vital body, but even on other things. And behind everything in material existence, there stand appropriate powers of the life world. So nothing exists in the material existence which does not have some power standing behind it in the vital world. Of course, you could look at the plant, and behind the plant there is a power. And it's different from the power of life energy embedded in the plant, which is enjoying it. There is a supporting life pattern, energy, formation, which presides over the plant generally. Now, if it presides over this individual plant generally, one can also recognize that there is a common part of that energy which presides over all the individual plants. And you could then recognize it as a kind of a collective formation for that plant species, presiding over it. So, two things are there here in this idea. From the life world, there is constant action upon us. Behind everything in the material world, there are appropriate powers in the life world. Those influence here, this has behind it a supporting life power. What does it mean in terms of, for the plant? There is a species energy imprint. If you can tap into that, you can change the species behavior. Now it's surprising, but once you see the implication, it will be obvious. There are individuals who enter as if into a pact with a species. So the snake charmers generally in India, especially the traditional lineages of snake charmers, have as if developed an affinity with the snake species. And the snake species knows that they will not harm them, the snakes, and in return the snakes will not harm the humans. And so there's a pact there. How does the pact work? You actually have to meet the representation of the species consciousness. How do you find it, or how do you meet it? Well, it appears to you as a being, conscious, living. How is that? And he'll explain that in the next sentence. But for now, just accept that it is so. So you meet the being, and the being says, all right, you want to make a pact, and you say yes. It puts its conditions, you have your conditions, and once the agreement is made, remember it is happening at the level of the energy bundle of you and it. Once that agreement is made, there's an alignment of energetic relationship in the vital world, of friendship, of mutuality of some kind, of support. Instantly, all things which are under influence of that energy pattern now find in the physical world that relationship represented. So my energy and the snake species energy met and had the shift, and automatically the snake represented in the physical world and me in the physical world have a shift in our relationship of energy. Obvious when you think about it like this, isn't it? Mother describes such an incident where the king of snakes, that's how we name that form or that entity of the snake species, it came to her. At the time, the ashram had a very large garden called Nandanam, and it was huge space. There were lots of snakes, and people were working in the garden to develop it, to grow plants, etc. And it was a problem. How do you manage the snakes? Because it's dangerous for you, and yet you don't want to harm it unless it harms you, but you're always afraid. So there was some struggle there, and some of the people were involved in chasing away the snakes, and even some of them were killed. And so the snake king came to the mother and said, let's make a pact. If your disciples do not harm me, I will not harm them. And mother said, it's great that you don't harm them, but I can't guarantee that they won't harm you. And so it was left at that. But it meant that already there was an attempt from the snake species in that space to reach out in relation to the human beings. But the human beings working there were dull, unconscious, unable to feel the snake species energy reaching out to say, come on, let's be friends, you don't need to kill us and we won't harm you. They couldn't, but the snake species recognized here was the head of these people, the mother, who was conscious, and they could reach out to her and made that contact. Similar experience, of course, with individual trees, including the banyan tree at the Matra Mandir. It put out a call to her saying it was in great pain, and mother called the administrator of Auroville and said, please go and check out. That tree came to me last night saying it is in great pain. So administrator goes there and finds that someone has stuck a knife into the tree to hang his shirt. And of course it was removed. But somewhere else in the ashram, in one of the guest houses, Castellini guest house, mother summoned the person looking after the guest house and said that, are you planning to cut the tree in the garden? And the fellow said, no, mother. The mother says, but the tree came to me last night and it was complaining that you're going to cut it. And then this fellow says, yes, mother, I'm very sorry. When I was standing in the garden, I was thinking, what if I cut the tree? I'll have so much more sunlight for the other plants. The tree caught that thought. It couldn't respond, or this man was too dull to receive the tree's response. But the tree knew where to go, the head of the community, being conscious, and it reached out. These incidents give you a glimpse of how much actually happens on those levels, to which we normal human beings are utterly blind, deaf, dumb to. For those beings who are working or engaging from there, they look at the human species and say, these people are useless, incapable of, so dull, so close, so dark in their inertia. They can't even feel we are reaching out to them. Between species, though, the interaction is much more free, because they are, of course, living much more in their vital. And so it happens that a bird species may enter in relation with a reptilian species and become friends. And then you see this, what we call symbiosis in nature. I've given these examples before, but they bear repeating in this context. There's a particular bird which is very small, fragile, delicate. It has a friendship with the crocodile species. And the crocodile opens its mouth, the bird hops in, jumps around between teeth and pecks out, removes the food which is stuck between the teeth, and the crocodile will never close to eat the bird. And whenever the bird comes, crocodile opens its mouth, the bird cleans up, gets its food, and then it flies around, it sits on the crocodile is happy, bird is happy. But they know they will not hurt each other. Similarly, there is a sea anemone and a clownfish. The clownfish has as if an immunity to the anemone, or rather the anemone will not prick it. The clownfish can rub itself against the anemone, no stings. The anemone instantly stings any fish that touches it, except the clownfish. How does it know? It senses energetically, oh, it's my friend. Species friendship. And so the clownfish acts to attract other fish who think it's safe, and instantly the anemone stings and eats them and leaves the remainder for this clownfish to eat. And neither can survive alone in the wild. How did this relationship ever develop? If both evolved separately, how did they ever develop this interdependence? It's a species meeting species. At what level? Not in the physical world, in their vital supporting origin of the energy presiding over each of the species. So, the life world is constantly acting upon us, and behind everything in material existence, there stand appropriate powers of the life world. And of course, at that level, you can change the relationship between those powers, and it will act instantly on the material world to change the relationship of things here. And now he goes further into this detail. Even the most crude and elemental of the physical world have behind them elemental life powers, elemental beings by which or by whom they are supported. So what is the most crude elemental in the physical world? Elements. Meaning what? You go down to the level of matter, and the elemental matter means going down to the basic the word slips me, the basic minerals in stone. If you look into the earth, you will find often there are mines where certain minerals cluster together. Why do they cluster here? Why didn't they all get mixed up? If according to what science tells us, the whole earth was at one point one big molten ball and it was swirling around, then the denser stuff should have settled below, lighter stuff settled above, and it should be pretty much even layer-wise. It's not. Within a single mountain, there are chunks, parts, corners which are completely different. In fact, so different that you don't have an explanation for it. And where there is suddenly here an entire quartz crystal cave, and somewhere else a completely different mineral forming whatever. And if you think about it, the crystalline cave of quartz, you've seen pictures, you walk into it, everything is so beautiful. It almost looks like a heavenly realm, and it stops with that one cave. You would think that it was as if made for someone or made by someone, and that's what intuitively we would feel, except not a human. And it is the case. In fact, they are these life elemental beings. The elemental being of the quartz would build this beautiful creation, and it will be an expression of its being, its joy, its beauty, its maturity, or its power to create in the physical world. And it will build it like that over how many millions of years? But it has built it, and it is present there. And you will see in all the traditional relationships with those spaces, they will say, this is sacred. Interesting that every sacred mountain is a mountain full of rich minerals that now the industrialists want to cut into and mine. Interesting, isn't it? And precisely because those minerals are richly present there because of the presiding beings and elemental beings. So Sri Aurobindo is using this word elemental in a particular way, and we will see shortly the further nuance of it. So even the most crude and elemental have behind them elemental life powers. Now remember, a life power, so far we were discussing it almost like a bundle of energy, is a living bundle of energy, and therefore conscious living bundle of energy. And conscious means intelligent, conscious living bundle of energy. And so when you meet it, you meet an intelligent, conscious being. And so he uses this word now, elemental beings, by which or by whom they are supported. Again, we must pause every time Sri Aurobindo uses a word, by which or by whom. Why didn't he just say by whom? Earlier he says elemental life powers, elemental beings. By which for the life powers, or by whom for the elemental beings. But it's almost as if they're equivalent. And the suggestion here is this is a gradation of these elemental beings or life powers, where at their lowest level it's almost as if they are not yet organized as beings. They seem almost mechanical life powers in their action closest to the material world. And as you rise above, they come into their own more and more into a vital, conscious, living, intelligent, elemental being, and a whole gradation in between. And that's the suggestion. In placing these two terms, there's a continuum between them. What does it mean then? It means you can reach out to them. The example we took earlier of the king of snakes species. But if there is a king for the entire species or an elemental being for the entire elemental domain, there are sub-focal points and smaller beings who correspond to specific regions, subdomains. So the cave will have its own elemental presiding being, which is as if a special emanation of the quartz elemental being, now specific to this cave. And when you enter into the cave, you are as if violating its domain. It may or may not like it may not be able to do much. But if it is strong, it may also react in a not so nice way. If you enter it with affection or with respect and even appreciation, then it may be happy and even invite you or even collaborate with you. You could, in principle, invite that being to assist or to create or even to grow or to share some knowledge or to help you in some work. Now, the implications of this are so great that it sounds too far out. In a piece of land which is desert, you could invoke the elemental beings to assist to create a little patch of water and bring nutrition into the soil and increase the life content until it can begin to grow. If you think about it, you realize this kind of thing has been done, except we were not conscious of the elemental beings involved. So people have created in the middle of barren desert a little pocket of a garden. The person who creates it will say, oh, I used principles of nature. So they will give to it a name. And they will say, we just used these principles and that's how it happened. An observer coming will say, you created a microclimate in the desert. What does it mean? Here the humidity is higher than everywhere else in the desert. Somehow because of that there is a precipitation. There's even a tiny little pond and all the plants which are growing are getting their water from there. We created a microclimate. But what do you mean by microclimate? This is one of the ways by which human beings often deceive themselves. You give a label to it and you say, now it's explained. No, you just labeled it. You didn't explain it. How is it that the wind blowing across the entire desert is not overwhelming your microclimate? The macroclimate is so much bigger and more powerful. And what we don't realize is that, well, you'd say physically some plants grew to block the wind. No, that's not enough. The wind can just blow right through. What we don't realize is that there are actually beings there who form that microclimate because the microclimate is their expression. They are beings who bring nutrition, who bring moisture, who provoke plant growth, who are beings of water, for example. And you could call them, invoke them, seek their help to build your little microclimate. And the microclimate actually represents a being which is their little kingdom, where a space which is their little kingdom for the beings to play around and live there. If suddenly someone comes and destroys it all, those beings are scattered and they are in great distress. And depending on the level at which they are, they could simply dissolve, dissipate, or they could find another place and try to kickstart rebuilding their little kingdom. I've been to certain gardens. Walking around, it was even a hotel which had a garden. Walking around, I felt in a particular corner, this was in Bangkok, I felt in that particular corner as if there was pretty strong living presence or even presences. And then I saw there was a little dollhouse, like dollhouse with doors, windows and things. It's as if someone had even used it for prayer. And so we asked the host, what is this? And they explained that it is a common thing in the culture of Thailand that every house keeps a little corner where they have a little house for the fairies and other beings of the house to live there and to be happy. Because we have come into their space, we don't want to drive them out, so we give them their little space and they are happy and they collaborate and things don't go bad. But if you do something to disturb them or to harm them or drive them out, they can be very vengeful and they can harm you and they can create trouble in your house. Your machines will start breaking down, things will catch fire, roof will become leaky. all kinds of problems start happening. At least that's the belief there. So somebody who comes from outside the tradition will say, oh, these people are so superstitious. But when you are inside the space, you recognize how true it is. Imagine these little ecosystems in the forest, and then human beings come and just cut down the trees, take over, cut plots, sell the land, someone builds a house. What happens to all the beings who were nurturing and nourishing that space? If they are strong enough and they are not simply dissolved, they get upset. They may hit back, they may create, if they can, or they may simply go away. But how far? Where do they go eventually? So recognizing that there are such things, one can even engage with them and live in harmony. And this used to be the tradition for most of the old cultures who were sensitive to such things. But the implications of this go much further. It's not just that they're building ecosystems locally, there are also larger systems. An entire forest will have a presiding being, or an action of the water elemental spirit in the forest, or other, and that's why the word elemental. They align to the elements. At heart we say 5 elements in a general way, but any action of these 5 elements also represent elemental workings. And so it would include all of the powers in nature, and anything working at the level of the basic powers of nature we call elemental beings or elemental energies or spirits. There will be microscopic workings where a few may be associated with a single tree. There may be larger working on the garden level, there may be larger ones working even on a macroscopic weather pattern. Those you can tap also or enter in relation with, call upon and say, please give us rain, and they respond. Or you can say, please hold back the rain, we need this work to be done, and they respond. Of course, they have their own compulsions, sometimes they may have their own expectations or demands. So they're not always like children who you can make a request, they may or may not accept. So we have incidents in the ashram, of course, very interesting ones. This was narrated to me by the head of the engineering section. At that time he was almost 85. He said he was present when they were building Golkund, and at some point they had to lay the roof. And the nature of the roof laying process is you have to lay it out in one go continuously. You can't lay one portion and then another portion. Where the two join, there will be a crack, water will always leak. So you have to lay it out in one go. They had started laying it out, cement was being poured, and gradually they found clouds gathering, and it seemed like it might rain, and the entire work would be ruined. So immediately they rushed to the mother. It should not rain, mother, until this is finished. And mother says, okay, I will ask Sri Aurobindo, because the rain gods, they listen to him much more than to me. What a sweet relationship. So she goes to Sri Aurobindo and says, it must not rain, they are doing this work. And Sri Aurobindo nods and simply says, let me know when the work is finished. So they go, the work goes on, clouds gather, they become so heavy you can smell the rain, but it's not yet raining. And after a while, Sri Aurobindo sends word, have they finished the work yet? So you can see obviously from the rain beings there was a pushback. Sri Aurobindo makes a request, but they were pushing back, okay, it's urgent now. And so Sri Aurobindo asks, okay, have you finished yet? And eventually, when they sent word that it was done, mother went and informed Sri Aurobindo. The moment he was informed, it's as if the clouds burst and the whole rain just showered in intensity. And mother commented on this, saying that when you interfere in this way, there is always some kind of reaction. If you stop it, the rain too long, well, it comes back with greater force, as if to compensate for that interference. But notice the relationship was not oppressive. It was not saying, push hard and block the rain. It was a request made. And the beings of the rain also pushed back, saying, it's getting, we really need to do this now, and so on. There's another incident I had read, which was recorded by a European anthropologist who was working in some part of Africa, deep in the forest, studying the cultures of the tribes of that space. And he was nice to them, they were very nice people. When he was leaving, they said, you know, you're a friend of ours, we will miss you being with us. And so we want to give you a gift. So he said, okay. And he said they began to dance. It's in the African rainforest. They began to dance. It was raining all around. They began to dance around him in a circle. And after a while he noticed the rain stopped. He looks up. Above him there's no rain. But everywhere else in the forest it continues to rain. So just in the circle they had formed, they were singing and dancing. They had as if stopped the rain flow just above it. Quite amazing. And they said, well, that's our gift to you. So he went back with a story that nobody would believe, or he had trouble sharing with people. But such things are normal in communities which live very close, in close affinity to nature, and there is a sensitivity to the beings of elemental processes of nature. And of course, from a spiritual consciousness, the awareness of these things can be so much more vivid and direct. It was another incident, and I'll end with that. In Karnataka, there was a drought. So devotees from there sent word to the mother, "Mother, there's a drought, we need rain." Mother said, okay. And immediately the rain started, and it went on for days and weeks. And the same devotees sent back a telegram to the mother, "Mother, please, there's too much rain, we're having floods, please, we need it to stop." And mother's comment was, ungrateful humanity. Rather than saying thank you, it was always complaining. The relationship is as if broken. When we have a spontaneous, natural relationship, we ask, they play with us, they give, we say thanks, and with gratitude we say, now that will be enough, we will call you when we next need. That would have been the healthy relation. But you see how human beings, we want enough, it's too much, stop it, on demand. You know, the sense of disconnection is so obvious. And because we are disconnected, we can destroy so much of nature. You can blame the educational system, you can blame the modern mentality which has become so excessively physically focused that it has cut off sensitivity to deeper and higher truths, of course the spiritual, but even of these lesser elemental realms. But whatever the actual cause, this is our problem today. And when we are speaking of climate change and all the problems, as we poison the world, those are the beings who suffer and experience the poisoning. And if they try to compensate for it, we hit back against their compensation. I recall it was in one of these UN Climate Summit meetings in Europe. There was a group that came from Switzerland, and they did a whole fancy presentation with statistics, how much glaciers are melting and things like that. And then one of the persons there said very indignantly, the glaciers are melting, and now we have lakes which are forming where people are living, and that's become a bigger problem. And I thought about it, and then I felt the need to make this observation. I said, first, you interfere with nature in a way that destroys nature. So of course the glaciers are melting, and what does nature do? Well, she protects the water by forming pools and lakes. You melt the snow, well, she'll still try to protect it now in liquid form. And you're upset about that, and you want to cut channels to drain out the lakes. The very method of nature's compensation, you want to further interfere, and then when she tries to compensate your interference, again you interfere. It's crazy. And we're not even thinking in those terms that nature is compensating, nature is rebalancing, should we align to her? So the moment we become conscious that there are these elemental life powers, elemental beings supporting every operation in the physical world, in nature, we can begin to put ourselves in better harmony with them. But again, the implications here, for that deeper knowledge, you can reach out to them, you can call upon them. Now, I will digress to expand on the occult side of the knowledge here. When dealing with the lesser elemental powers, as Sri Aurobindo describes, the methods of the occult systems have a different approach than dealing with the elemental beings who are more conscious or more developed. There can be a different approach. So, especially in the realm which we call magic or occultism, which is more mechanical, they tap into these lower realms, which are more elemental energies, less of beings. Rather, they're conscious, but they're still bound in the more mechanical aspect. And that's where the mechanical systems operate. For example, there'll be formulas for invoking rain. So you draw this symbol, you put these particular objects, or you light a particular fire, repeat these particular words so many times, and that will invoke the rain. Very physical, mechanical process. What it does, if you go back to the root principle behind each object which is brought in, or the numbers or drawings and symbols which are written, they are basically representations aligned to or resonating with that particular vibration of the elemental powers associated with the rain, and tapping into them and arranging or putting them in a relation which causes their action of the rain force. A higher way of working, which would tap directly into the rain beings, would not be so mechanical. It might involve, for example, a prayer or an invocation, less of the mechanical aspect of the machinery, more of the psychological component of the appealing. Sometimes most effective, of course, are those which mix both aspects of the intervention. But quite different from any of these is the spiritual intervention, where with a conscious awareness you reach out with love and the request is made, as we saw in the example of Sri Aurobindo. And these elemental beings include even fire, for example, water, air flow. You can influence the strong wind, even the tornado-like workings. Fire you could create to invoke or put out by appropriate interventions. And very often these kinds of training involve, they use the word mastering that element. And it's a crude word when you think from a higher perspective, because all you're doing is putting yourself in a position of dominance to certain elemental forces. Or even if it is an elemental being, you're entering a relationship of what you feel is dominance. Because once you've completed that ritual of the mastery, it's as if you can will that force and the thing just happens. Or rather, that being is as if supportive to you. Except you don't realize that in the processes that you used to build that relationship of dominance, you had to submit to its requirements. And sometimes to maintain that relationship, you have to maintain that submission through whatever processes, rituals, invocations. You have to satisfy and appease it, depending on what level of being. By on certain days, on the full moon, you have to give a certain offering and give it its due. Or you must follow certain lifestyle where you do not eat certain kinds of food and do certain things. And you realize what you just did. You became its dependent in order to imagine that you are controlling it. And it's kind of foolish. And if you look at those systems of occult practices, the people who claim that mastery over the elements, well, they can light a fire with a word or call the wind with a certain invocation or gesture, are now so bound to that they can't live a normal life. They are not free. They are bound to all these trappings. And in the very act of engaging and forming this alignment with these powers, their influence begins to fill you, and I'll use the word possess you. When you think you have possessed it, it has possessed you. And if it is a lesser being, its desire impulses, remember it's vital world. It is made of desire impulse. Its desire impulses now begin to seep into you and mold your nature. And quickly you grow into its image. if you have tapped into one of those lower vital beings, you find its types of desires emerging in you. Even your form, your behavior now begins to reflect it. It is having its gratification through you. What happens to your growth, your independence, or your spiritual or even mental progress? You have none. You have become trapped under its influence, not realizing it. And it's the reason why most of the people who enter into these kinds of low level, what they call black magic, are primarily driven by desire, greed, impulsiveness of these types. And if you even approach them, the vibes are so crude, so filthy. From a distance you see and say, I'd rather stay away. But the rationale of it now becomes obvious when you understand what's actually happening. So, we move on now to a more general statement. The influences of the life world are always pouring out on the material existence and producing their powers and results, which return again upon the life world to modify it. Again, an extraordinary statement. You see, each of these statements is building on the previous very logically, but each is adding a new insight. So, from the vital world, the influences come down all the way, are always pouring out on the material existence. The description is huge, multifaceted influence, pouring down like rain constantly onto the material existence, producing their powers and results. So the results here modify the life world, the powers expressed here modify the life world. It's not just that the physical is a slave of the vital, equally there's a dual connection. So, the influences of the life world are always pouring out on the material existence and producing their powers and results, which return again upon the life world to modify it. Now, straight away, let's look at the other implications from the perspective of the occult science. It means if you tap some of these returning influences, you can influence things of the vital easily. And if through the returning influences you modify some vital energy pattern, it will then affect the physical world. Very interesting idea. Now, what are the returning influences? So obviously in the tree, you have an influence of the life energy growing the tree, at least in its growing phase. But what happens when the tree is fading? The flower is growing, the energy is pushing in. What happens when the flower is fading? The energy is being released, withdrawn, as if floating back, isn't it? If you can catch that movement, you can send an influence up. What happens when a material object is sublimated? It becomes more fine, more subtle, and at which point it influences the vital much more easily than when it is rigidly bound in matter. So here's a very practical implication. When you light incense, for example, what's happening? The wood or other physically bound perfumes associated with the incense, as it burns, it sublimates to some extent, becomes this fine perfume, subtle, almost non-physical in its tangibility, and that's the time when it begins to influence the environment of the vital or even mental domain. And this is the reason why perfumes are so valued, both for spiritual utility as well as magical utility. So in the magical traditions, they will have specific perfumes for invoking specific elemental beings or powers or deities who are fond of that. When you light that perfume, it's as if you're sending an influence using a physical means, sublimating where it influences the lower vital ranges, and invites or makes a vibrational qualitative shift which makes possible the manifestation of that energy more easily. Practically, for us, you light a perfume or incense, and if it is of a sufficiently clear kind, you feel very quickly as if the environment shifts in grade of vibration. It becomes clearer, more positive, or you could even make it more negative if it was a negative perfume. But We want to make it more positive. You light a perfume and suddenly now you feel the air more clear, vibrationally, but also thoughts becoming more clear, less of the negative, disturbing thoughts. And this is the idea behind it, and that's why these things were so valued in rituals, in traditions. So a lot of knowledge which overlaps between the spiritual and occult symbolism, but they come from the tradition where for a while humanity developed this knowledge even to perfection, to be able to create and invoke any energetic shift or mental shift, or even invoke a spiritual presence by such means which were almost mechanical seeming. Except they are not just material, they are actually engaging with higher worlds, but from a process which is from matter reaching upwards. Notice how even in the symbol, the flame that you light, it's always pointing upward, always rising upward. Whatever is burnt is as if liberated in the light and then floats up and drifts into the height. You take a candle flame, turn it upside down, the flame will still go and point up. You can never prevent it from pointing up. So even in the symbol, it's as if the flame, Agni, takes material, breaks up the poisons, purifies, releases and rises upward. The physical symbolism is representing the deeper truth that all that it takes is also rising in gradation of influence on a finer scale of subtler worlds and influencing the air. So as a symbol, the flame lit physically is also doing exactly what happens within you in your conscious spiritual aspiration. You become conscious of your aspiration, and whatever you have within your nature which is contrary to it, you place in relation to the aspiration, or as the mother says, put it into the fire of your aspiration. And the same coarse impulse or desire which you don't want, as you put it into the fire, it consumes, decomposes the coarseness, liberates the innate, purer, finer truth of it and releases it, and it rises within your whole being as a purifying influence. That's what happens in a spiritual sense internally in pure consciousness. That's what is therefore represented physically in the flame which represents that, Agni, and does the same process. And it has this effect of rising influence through worlds, at least the lower ranges of the lower worlds. It doesn't need to go all the way to the spiritual. But the pure concentration within you can rise all the way to the highest spiritual, and in response call down. Sri Aurobindo uses the phrase, the little smoke of sacrifice calling down the rain of God's bounty. The physical sacrifice even has the effect of calling down response from above, maybe even as a physical rain. But here within you, the psychological, the spiritual movement calls down the rain of the divine descent in response to your aspiration. When you start observing this movement across inner and outer, the parallels are so striking. You come to recognize that what you're doing in the physical world with physical objects is only in the material representation of the psycho-spiritual truths within you. Just as the flame was represented here, the waters also represent the consciousness within you and the levels of consciousness that flow. And so you put the water and the flame in certain relationship. You're producing in symbolic physical terms the same arrangement of adjustment within you. So recall the earlier part of the discussion, how everything in the vital world projects out the physical world as a representation for embodiment. But everything that happens there, therefore, represents here symbolically, but bound inside form. But if you take the logic all the way through, then all the higher ranges of worlds also have their symbolic representation bound inside form. And we as human beings have all these levels within us, And whatever happens within us is also what is happening externally, bound in material form, in the symbol of matter. And the two are identical, at least in symbol. Now the paragraph continues. There are many more important statements. We have barely come halfway through the paragraph, but because of time we'll have to pause here. Instead, I will read from an interesting portion from Sri Aurobindo, where in one of his letters he describes this, and it will be perfect conclusion for what we have so far read and studied. If we regard the gradation of worlds or planes as a whole, we see them as a great, connected, complex movement. The higher precipitate their influences on the lower. The lower react to the higher and develop or manifest in themselves, within their own formula, something that corresponds to the superior power and its action. The material world has evolved life in obedience to a pressure from the vital plane. Mind in obedience to a pressure from the mental plane. So in our evolution, it's these planes pressing on us. It, mind, is now trying to evolve supermind in obedience to a pressure from a supramental plane. Now very simply, if pressure from the mental world created mind or developed mind, pressure from vital world created life, the moment the supramental plane begins to act, it's going to do its thing. Whether you like it or not, whether you participate or not, consciously, it will happen. But if you participate and give a possibility for it to be received, it happens so much more rapidly. In more detail, particular forces, movements, powers, beings of a higher world can throw themselves on the lower to establish appropriate and corresponding forms which will connect them with the material domain and, as it were, reproduce or project their action here. So in the Veda, the gods described as the Maruts, they represent the thought impulses within us. They are not the formed conscious thought, but emotions pushing as a thought impulse. You are half awake and you feel it's uncomfortable, switch on the fan. The impulse which moves from emotion to thought, that's the grade which corresponds to the powers or beings that we call the Maruts, which in their action in the physical world is the base for the storm clouds and the thunderstorm working in the clouds. Interesting. And if you go carefully into the grade of consciousness within you and that grade of that phenomena, you'll see very interesting commonalities, similarities, because it's the same power operating. It's something we will perhaps touch upon next time. Within us, therefore, since all these planes are mapped out, working in our consciousness within us, we can actually feel or reach out into those domains, act upon them, or sense what is happening in them. But we won't go into that now. So they reproduce in the material plane or project their action here. And each thing created here has supporting it subtler envelopes or forms of itself which make it subsist and connect it with forces acting from above. Man, for instance, has besides his gross physical body subtler sheaths or bodies by which he lives behind the veil in direct connection with supra-physical planes of consciousness and can be influenced by their powers, movements and beings. What takes place in life has always behind it pre-existent movements and forms in the occult vital planes. What takes place in mind presupposes pre-existent movements and forms in the occult mental planes. That is an aspect of things which becomes more and more evident, insistent and important the more we progress in a dynamic yoga. Now, none of this would matter in a yoga which has as goal withdrawal from the world. You just want to extinguish it all anyway. But if you have a yoga which aims to develop and transform, all this becomes enormously important. And he uses the word at some point, insistent. It becomes more evident, insistent, and important. But then concluding, having described this, we would tend to think only in fixed connections. But all this must not be taken into rigid and mechanical a sense. It is an immense plastic movement full of the play of possibilities and must be seized by a flexible and subtle tact or sense in the seeing consciousness. So I think we will pause here. The rest of the paragraph goes in further detail of how these powers act on us and how we can relate to them even as friends or enemies and so on. But all this is enormously mixed in understanding, and he looks forward to something which has to develop, where he says a future science can rediscover these truths. We'll continue this next Friday.